Good morning for my online classes, my full semester and my second 8 weeks political science, POLS 1113, I-92 and I-93 classes for the spring 2016 semester. Glad to have you here once again. We're going on into Chapter 6 on public opinion. I'm recording this on February the 9th, a Tuesday morning with some dappled sunlight coming through as the sun rises. And this is also the day of the New Hampshire primary, as we will be covering later on this semester. In the next few weeks, I'll have them recorded roughly a week or so before the due dates of the test. But we'll be talking about then, I would think, in early March, we'll be covering some chapters that deal with the primary system and how we pick our presidential candidates. But for many of you, I'm sure, that have been watching the news, reading about it, we know that this is a big event happening here today, and there'll be several more big events, including the Oklahoma primary, which will be part of Super Tuesday on March the 1st. But this time we're looking at public opinion, which is certainly tied into the presidential selection process as we look at public opinion polls. Chapter 6, Public Opinion. So two of the broad themes that we cover throughout this chapter deal with how opinions are formed and how our opinions are measured. So if you have an opinion, let's say someone asks you a question about the war in Syria, and your response to the war in Syria is, I don't know. I don't know anything about it. I don't know where Syria is located. I don't know who's involved, and I don't care. Let's just say that those are your responses. It is still an opinion. And it still is an opinion that can be measured. It does tell us something if a survey is conducted about U.S. involvement or projected U.S. involvement in the war in Syria, and 50% of the people respond to the survey by saying, I don't know, or I don't care, then that's an important opinion. Even if it really tells us, of course, that the people don't know anything about Syria, it still is a very important issue to be measured regarding that particular event. So, in that sense, that's where we can see how we all do matter in the collection of opinions, and then also regarding how those opinions are formed. So it is important to consider that a public opinion poll is a snapshot of the public at that moment. And you can read about that on page 240. So in that sense, the way people may feel about a particular event in one public opinion poll may drastically change in a month later. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the public opinion poll was incorrect, although it could be if you measure it against others. But they can still just say that that shows how the opinion has changed, and may change quite drastically. Just like a snapshot. Take a snapshot of a person, and then perhaps within another month or so, that person could have changed. Maybe their hairstyle changed. Maybe some other part of their appearance changed. And so it's the same way that you could look at public opinion polls as well. So just to keep in mind, think about how things have changed here. This was a public opinion poll in the summer of 2016 when I was recording this survey. And this would have been, recording the lecture at that time, this would have been in June. And so notice in June you had who was ahead. This was before Donald Trump got into the race. And so if you notice there, you have one individual, the governor of Wisconsin, actually two people from this survey at that time who are no longer even in the race for president. The governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker, he's now dropped out. And Ron Paul, a senator from Kentucky, he's out of the race as well. And actually, excuse me, that should be Rand Paul is the name that I should have had on there. Nevertheless, those two individuals are out of the race. Jeb Bush I haven't seen a survey in quite some time that actually had him in first place. But that was the snapshot that was taken at that time. And so here you're seeing in 2016, again in the summer, Martin O'Malley has already dropped out of the race, as has Jim Webb, the two names you see there at the bottom of the survey. Joe Biden never got in the race. And Hillary Clinton is not 46 percentage points ahead of Bernie Sanders. If anything, based on surveys that I've recently watched, here I am again, February 9th recording this. So you go from June to February, and some of the surveys now suggest that both of these individuals are essentially in a tie. So this was a snapshot at that time, and how things now change with a snapshot now. So again, that was the current poll, again, for the summer, and it has changed certainly in some ways. Carson's not that high. So when I say current, just take in regard that we're looking at something that was done later on in the summer when I was recording this. And so this is a little bit off from where we are. Trump, I think, does have that, roughly that number, but Carson doesn't have that high of a number, nor does, I suppose, Bush does, but Cruz and Rubio have both increased in their numbers. And Clinton is certainly not that high of Sanders. So you can think of, just go and check your own surveys now and see what differences you may find. So it's a little misleading for me to put that up there as current, but when I was recording it this summer, it would have been current. We know now that really, for example, in the Democrats on the surveys, it's a two-person race. There's only two people in the and that will be on the ballot, essentially, that will be recognized as the major candidates. Gallup is one of our better-known poll firms and poll-taking firms. And in the 2012 presidential election, they were wrong. They had predicted that Mitt Romney would win the race. And a former governor of Massachusetts, a Republican candidate for president in 2012. And so there had to be some representation or some explanation as to why they were wrong in the survey. And I should just point this out, too. It wasn't really Gallup, but there were some well-known poll-taking firms, in particular the Des Moines Register, a major newspaper in the state of Iowa, for the Iowa caucus. If you've been following this story, they had projected that Donald Trump would win the Iowa caucus, and he was 7 percentage points ahead of Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, and Senator Cruz ended up winning that race. So there'll be a need for some explanation there as well. But this was the after-action report, in a sense, what Gallup put together on why they did get it wrong in 2012. And it's worth noting today that this could help to explain why sometimes firms get their numbers wrong when they're conducting a public opinion poll. So a misidentification of likely voters, underrepresentation of regions, that's a key one if you're doing a national survey. Faulty representation of race and ethnicity, non-standard sampling method used residential phone directories. And that's really pretty stunning to think that a major poll-taking firm would, number 4 there, use a phone book to try to identify people to participate in their survey. So this is an explanation as how they got it wrong. All right, so that's some of how we go about measuring public opinion when we look at some of the background there to surveys, the snapshots that surveys do. And now we'll shift our attention then to learn about political socialization. You can see this here on page 217 in your text, how we learn about politics. We all go through this process. So again, let me stress that even if you're an individual who's not that interested in politics, you still have a public opinion, and you still have an opinion, even if you don't really know about some particular issue. That's an opinion that's worth measuring. So how do we learn? Well, we all learn in many ways from different organizations, from different groups of people, such as friends. And for many of you, you're going through a transition in your life. For many of you taking this class, let's say that you're 17, 18, 19 years old, and I would think that's still the largest portion of students that I have, and I know I have students of all ages. But if you're roughly in that area, you're seeing that transition in which the most important organization or group that's influenced your opinion is now you're going to a transition to a different one. And so you're going from your parents to your friends. And so this becomes a very important transition in your life. And so your friends are going to influence your way of thinking. So it is, of course, part of the reality that you ought to consider who you're choosing as your friends in that case, and realize what kind of influence, positive and negative, they may be having on your life. So when we think about agents of political socialization, starting on page 217, well, the best known throughout a good portion of the early stages of your life would be your family, primarily your parents, but whoever's raised you. So, just think back when you were in third grade, let's say. I mean, the teacher would have had a lot of influence in your life, but certainly your parents would have had an influence on your life, or your grandparents, again, whoever was there to raise you. And you probably would not have that. I mean, just the circle in your orbit would have been a very small group of people primarily. And so whatever they thought about politics, if they ever shared that with you, that's what you would have known. We have seen some changes in our society in this regard, the decline of the two-parent household. Some change there, as we can see, from 1980 to 2012, and probably that trend has continued. And I think one of the interesting points there is there's still going to be someone raising children. So it's just had some alteration in the formation of who's doing the raising in that case. So we see some changes there. So how do we define a traditional family, right? That can become somewhat of an issue because of the changes that we're seeing in our society. Also, then, when it comes to agents of political socialization, the media, and think about the media choices that you make in your life on what you choose to decide or to shape your viewpoints about the world. And so one of the great things, but also challenges in our world today, is there's just so many different sources of information out there. And what you can then do, more than, I suppose you could have always done this to some degree, but you can pick information that is very selective, that it's like going to a buffet, and if all you want to eat is mashed potatoes, then you can do it. And so if you want to go to the same news source time and time again and get the same information time and time again, you can do that and never have your point of view challenged or disrupted. And that's what the choices that we can make in media can allow us to do. And we'll certainly cover this more when we get to Chapter 7. You can also just see with the new forms of the media that you can also just learn from other people what they select to be important stories and what they post on Facebook, for example. And so I bet we've all been in some conversation where someone has said, I read this on Facebook. And then you can make your own decision whether or not that was a good choice that somebody made there. But clearly that's part of a way in which we see how the media influences us. So even if we don't read those media sources, we may be friends with people who do read those media sources. And the same thing can be said about religion. So some of you taking this class, maybe many of you, are personally not that involved in religion, but you may have friends that are, or you have associates, again, through Facebook, let's say. They post something of a religious nature, and that's going to have some influence on your way of thinking. So churches certainly do have, and other religious organizations do have an influence on our viewpoints about politics. And certainly schools. I mean, schools to some degree aren't neutral about this subject. I mean, they're going to, for example, perhaps create some mythology about particular figures in our history, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. After all, the month of February is where we have President's Day, and so both of those presidents were born in February. And we start thinking about their lives, and do we have some imagery about both those individuals that may not be entirely accurate, but is a type of image and story that we want young people to consider and to think about. And our peers, our friends, again, the people that we associate, that's going to also shape our viewpoints about politics. When it comes to our peers and the people that we're around, I would think some of you have found yourself in a position in which you've been tempted or you have become a change agent. Do you say, well, maybe we should think a little differently about that group of people? Maybe the stories that you're saying or the jokes that you're saying or the words you're using to describe those other individuals, that's not entirely right or accurate, and maybe we should change our view. And sometimes that's referred to as political correctness, and perhaps it does go too far. But clearly, the way that we describe one another does have an impact on how we view one another. And so the language that we choose to use will have an impact on how we treat one another as well. And so the changes in our society have happened because individuals have said, well, I think we ought to maybe use some other kind of language there. A change agent, Margaret Mead, sociologist and anthropologist, has pointed out that this is what causes change in the world. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It's the only way that we've seen change actually occur. And so you may find yourself to be a change agent. Maybe you have been one. And maybe that's important for all of us somewhere along the way to be that way. And of course, political parties. If you have a certain viewpoint about a political party, that's going to have an impact on how you view the world. And if you're a strong partisan individual and you support one political party much more than the other, then you're going to see the world through the prism of that political party. And you're going to give political leaders of that party a benefit of the doubt, perhaps, that you wouldn't give political leaders of the other party. And so that's going to have an impact on how you, again, view the world. So when we think about the impact of families, for example, this was always an interesting observation that was made here. 12 of 13 presidential elections were picked correctly by a magazine used by school children. I think this goes from grade school children all the way up to high school children. They used something called the Weekly Reader. And only in 1992 was the survey within that magazine wrong. So this is one of the most accurate surveys that we've ever seen, and it's asking school children who's going to win the election. But of course, in most cases, what they're doing is hearing what their parents have said, and that's what they're going to put down in the survey. So we can see the influence of families, mainly parents, in these surveys. So again, if we think about schools, what is the proper image that should be given to someone like George Washington? So I think of some of you that are going into education, and you're going to be, let's say, a grade school teacher, very important job. And when you have a role in social sciences and you're teaching some section of social science, and it's February, and so now George Washington's name pops up, you know, what do you need to say about George Washington? And do you say things to the children when they are in the 3rd grade that would be different that you would say to young people when they're in the 8th grade, or when they're sophomores, or when they're in college? You know, how do we change? And if we change, then do people look back and say, well, maybe I wasn't told the straight story about George Washington when I was a younger person, and what should we know? And is it appropriate to have some mythology involved in someone like George Washington? And so this leads us to all kinds of challenges, certainly for our education system. It's a very powerful book. We have this over in our library here at the NEO Miami campus. Lies My Teacher Told Me. And James Loewen is the author. He's also the individual who wrote the book Sundown Towns, which we talked about in the lecture before this. And his argument is that our history is done inaccurately and poorly in our education system, that we need to be more truthful in our history. But it is fair to say, you know, how much negativity do you want to spread when we deal with history? But is that part of the reality that we have to cover? So an important book and a very thought-provoking book to consider the way we go about teaching history here in the United States. So when we think about religion and how it impacts opinion, so even people who are not religious may have less support for those who are not in any way supportive of religion. So it does tell us then that religion is important, even for people who are not personally that religious. So when they ask in the University of Minnesota poll, a well-known poll for measuring this area of public opinion, an atheist was the least trusted minority. So if you look at, in this case, you put people in categories of minority beyond just race, but just different ways of thinking, different religions, and atheist is the least trusted. So in their category, who would you be least likely to vote for? They even had categories such as someone who's an alcoholic or drug use or has filed bankruptcy. All those were issues that were not as bad in terms of trustworthiness than being an atheist. But when we study religion, we can also, as you can see there in the second bullet point, look at the issue of what's referred to as religiosity and the degree of belief in religion. So it's not enough, and we can see here the nuances involved in putting together a survey. So when you do a survey, it's not enough to just simply say, are you religious? Yes, no. That may not really tell us enough on the survey. You may need to go into more detail. So how do you measure someone's views of religiosity? How often they go to church? Could we not conclude that somebody who goes to church once or twice a year is different than someone who goes to church once or twice a week? Belief in the Bible, can we not determine that there's a difference in, again, religiosity if one person believes that the Bible is just a collection of myths from past generations and someone else believes the Bible is the direct word from God? Well, that, I would think, tells us those are two individuals that may both say that they're religious, but clearly there's a different view in their religiosity. So just share this with you again from the University of Minnesota. Household sampling of more than 2,000 households. University researchers found that Americans rate atheists below Muslims, recent immigrants, gays and lesbians, and other minority groups in sharing their vision of American society. Atheists are also the minority group most Americans are least willing to allow their children to marry. So in other words, you could say, who would you want your son or daughter to marry? They're least willing to say, go ahead and marry the atheist. So as Huffington Post, an online news magazine that I believe I have as one of our options that you could choose from if you're interested in looking this over, Americans would rather vote for a philandering, pot-smoking president than an atheist one. So it is interesting, right? So you'd have an atheist president, doesn't fool around, doesn't use drugs, and still there would be people who would not support that individual. More people would not support that individual than the one who believes in God but fools around and smokes pot. We have had, at least on the record, Congressman Pete Stark is the only individual so far that has come forward, and he's now passed away, but has stated publicly that he did not believe in the afterlife and did not believe in God, and he's the only one. So it does let us know that there seems to be very few people, at least publicly, that are willing to come forward and say this in Congress. And perhaps there's not very many that are actually elected in that case as well. It is worth noting, though, that in our society, and I'm just kind of sharing this with you, you can go online and check this out and go to Google and Google the symbols that are found in the Arlington National Cemetery. So for veterans who are buried in the Arlington National Cemetery, these are just some of the many different symbols that can be put on a gravestone, grave marker at Arlington, and that does include also the atheist symbol, as well as many other Christian symbols, Islamic symbols, Jewish symbols, and other religions as well. Back to the issue then of conducting a sample. In order to have a successful sample, the best way to ensure that you have a successful sample is to follow these guidelines. Sample must be random, sample must have an accurate size, and the sample must reflect the diversity of the population. There are different types of polls, as we can see here. Tracking polls, major trends. There's a lot of tracking polls going on right now in our presidential season here, the selection of our presidential candidates. So several days before the New Hampshire primary, that you can certainly see a tracking poll, trends. What are the trends that you can measure among the candidates? Who's trending upward, who's trending downward, for example. And you can go online if you're interested in this, and you can check out some different surveys that will show you this. That's an important contribution, really. So consider what's going on there. And so if you're interested, again, just kind of Google tracking poll New Hampshire primary. Of course, by the time you see this, it will already be gone, but maybe look at Super Tuesday primaries and going on for March 1st, let's say, and that would give you some ideas. Donald Trump tracking upward? Is he tracking downward? Marco Rubio, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders. Some interesting ways of looking at it. Campaign technique is a push poll. We'll go into a little more detail about that. And then the exit polls, question voters after voting. This gives us some idea of why people voted the way they did. So in other words, how were we able to determine, for example, in the Democrat caucus in Iowa, that 85% of the people ages 18 to 25 that participated in the Democratic caucus voted for Bernie Sanders? How do we know that? Well, I mean, because there's not some way of measuring every single 18 to 25-year-old. So what's been done is there was a survey, and people after the Iowa caucus were asked, who did you vote for? And then there were other numbers that were gathered based on information for that one particular person. How old are you? What religion do you belong to, if any? What education level do you have? On down the list. And so that's how you use exit polls. Of course, part of the question for an exit poll would be how many people are willing to participate. There were some key differences in the Republican caucus on numbers. Donald Trump did very well among Republicans who had a high school education or less. He did very well. Those who had postgraduate work were more likely to vote for Ted Cruz. So some big differences there among the candidates on the Republican side. Push poll used to spread disinformation on page 247. So a push poll is not organized to try to gather information. It's trying to spread, as we can see, their disinformation. So it's disguised as a way to, in a sense, use a negative ad. And if you read through page 247, you'll get some strong evidence of how a negative ad was used in a push poll. And I think about the push polls and the strategy of using a push poll, and I go back to the movie The Candidate. Came out in 1972. You can probably see this on YouTube. It's worth watching. and a young Robert Redford who's now in his 80s and doesn't look that much different than what he's in the movie here, but nevertheless, fantastic performance, and of somebody who's a political novice who wants to do good things as a candidate and has an idealistic approach, and yet he's now confronted with the question, do you want to win? And how badly do you want to win? And what are you willing to do in order to win? And what are you willing to do to your opponent in order to win? So I always think about this movie when I think of a push-pull. And for some of you that are thinking about running for office, you're wanting to be involved. I think that's great. I hope that more of you want to be politically involved and are willing to run for office. Would you be willing to conduct something like a push-pull, or to have somebody working for you do something like a push-pull in order to defeat your opponent and give you a chance to win? That's a challenging question. And that certainly is something, again, read through that page, think about this movie, and think about the moral dilemma of what it means to run for office and what you're faced with if your choice is go this route and have a better chance of winning, or avoiding this political tactic and have less of a chance of winning. Which one are you willing to do? So when we think of ideology and party identification, some different ways of looking at the use of surveys, it is, again, interesting to note that this does create different viewpoints. So where you stand in many ways is based on where you sit, and there's a reality there. So ideology and party identification has some impact on how you view something like political, or in this case, economic inequality. Page 233 in your text. This is probably changing all the time, but it does give us some idea. In fact, it perhaps, if anything, is not fully showing the strength of the top 1% in our society. But top 1%, and this, one of the recent surveys controls close to 1/5 of the whole U.S. economy. I'm assuming that actually is much greater than what I have put together there now. But it does let us know that we are witnessing some times in our society right now where there's a considerable growth in income inequality. What to be done about it? It leads to all kinds of questions in our political situation. But perhaps this is the most important question that needs to be answered. Is there something that can be done about it? So that leads us then to some different viewpoints about ideology, the overall framework on how we approach these issues and how we view the world. So spend some time reading on pages 213, 214. You'll see Elizabeth Warren used as an example of a liberal. And then you have Senator Elizabeth Warren. Then you have Senator Charles Grassley as an example of a conservative. And so think about those differences there, and looking at key issues on what you would support or oppose to help define the parameters of being a liberal or a conservative. Pages 213, 214. This is a few years old, but we can see here the breakdown. And so there are more people in the country that at least view themselves as conservative than liberal. And the question could be, do you view yourself that way? Is that your overall approach to how you identify yourself? Or are there specific issues that you can turn to say that's why I'm a liberal or a conservative? So it's one thing to identify yourself that way. It's another to actually come up with concrete examples of how you identify yourself. So we can conclude here by just looking at the importance of political knowledge. Increased political knowledge should lead to political efficacy. Again, beginning of this semester in Chapter 1, we talked about the reason for having this class. The need to have knowledge leads to political efficacy. The more efficacy, the ability to influence government and politics, more likely you're going to participate. And go beyond voting, but you're going to be an informed citizen, and that becomes the first step. So then when you're asked a survey, to participate in the survey. You're comfortable doing so, and you're sharing your opinion, and you have an opinion. You have thought about these issues, and that then is very important, of course, for our political system. So again, this is a few years old, but it does give us some idea of a survey, if it's accurate, on what are the most important issues. And probably in some ways, here we are in 2016. And think about, though, what's brought out in our campaigns. And is dissatisfaction with government certainly a pretty high level in our surveys? Is it at a pretty high level? It seems to me that it is when we look at our campaigns. Well, that's Chapter 6, looking at how opinions are formed and how we measure public opinion. Next week, we'll be turning our attention to the media on Chapter 7.